What would you do if the place you called home suddenly felt too small, not because the walls had moved, but because your dreams had grown larger than the space between them? For months, Jack and Tu Tien had been building something invisible. Not walls, not a roof, a version of life they could see clearly. Every time they closed their eyes, a garden that fed them. Mornings without alarms, work that mattered deeply, and ground beneath their feet that was theirs and no one else's. But they had been building it all in borrowed space. And borrowed space has a quiet, persistent way of reminding you it belongs to someone else. It shows up in small ways, in the way you hesitate before hammering a nail, in the way you plan around someone else's boundaries instead of building toward your own. There is a particular kind of restlessness that comes when a person knows they are ready for the next version of their life, but have not yet found the physical place to grow into it. Jack had been carrying that restlessness for months. So had Tu Tien. They had just never said it out loud at the same time until they finally did. This is the story of the day they stopped waiting. The afternoon started quietly. Too quietly, almost. Jack and Tu Tien sat together on the old wooden porch, the kind of porch that creaks when you shift your weight, that holds the memory of 100 small conversations in its boards. Between them on the floor, hand-drawn sketches, printouts folded at the corners, photographs of houses and hillsides pulled from screens and carefully pinned into the shared imagination of two people who had spent a long time wanting the same life from different angles. Jack picked up one of the sketches. He had drawn it months ago, rough lines for a farmhouse structure, south-facing windows, notes in the margins about water storage and equipment access. Practical, deliberate. He held it up in the afternoon light and said nothing for a long moment. Tu Tien was looking at a photograph. Not a house, a garden, rows of something green and orderly, a fire pit in the far corner, a low wooden table where people sat close together in the early evening. She tapped the photograph once, the way a person touches something they have already decided to keep. "We're not going to find it sitting here," Jack said finally. She folded the photograph carefully and placed it in her bag with the others. "Then, let's stop sitting." They left that same afternoon. Jack drove. Tu Tien had the map open on her phone but rarely looked down at it. She was watching the land outside the window instead, reading the terrain the way some people read faces, looking for something she couldn't quite name but would recognize the moment she saw it. They were heading toward the outer edges of the area, away from the noise and the cement-heavy developments crowding the main roads, moving toward the kind of ground that still had silence in it. The first property they stopped at was too flat. Good drainage. Jack noted immediately he always checked drainage first, always thought in systems and consequences. But the surrounding plots were already being carved up for development. Whatever piece existed there now would not survive 3 years. They exchanged a look and moved on without needing to discuss it. The second location felt more promising from the road. They parked and walked it together. Tu Tien moving a few steps ahead the way she always did when something needed to be felt rather than measured. The soil was dry at the surface. Water access would require significant cost. And there was something about the afternoon light, a western obstruction that would pull the sun away too early, which mattered deeply for growing anything that needed warmth. Jack didn't say it first. Tu Tien did. "We'd spend all our time compensating for what it can't give us," she said, already turning back toward the car. He smiled despite himself. She was right, and she always arrived at the right answer through a completely different door than he did. That was one of the reasons they made good partners. His calculations and her instincts had been wrong at the same moment, only a handful of times across years of working together. He had learned to trust both. By the third hour, the light had shifted to a heavier gold and neither of them was talking much. The silences between them on days like this were not uncomfortable. They were the silences of two people thinking hard about the same thing and not needing to perform the thinking out loud. But underneath the silence, The weight of deflating expectation was beginning to press. This happens on days like this. You carry a dream tightly all morning, and by early evening you can feel it losing pressure, the sharp outlines softening into something vague and manageable and disappointing. Then Jack almost turned at an intersection, almost kept driving. He slowed instead, turned down a road that was unpaved. Unpaved roads, he had learned, meant fewer eyes had been here recently, which meant land that hadn't yet been divided and sold in pieces for fast development. The tree line on either side was old, not recently planted, which told a story about how long this place had been left undisturbed. Something in his chest shifted. Not certainty, something quieter than certainty. Attention. They pulled over without a word. The plot opened in front of them on a gentle incline. Not dramatic, not the kind of landscape that announces itself with beauty, but considered, honest. The kind of land that gives you something to work with rather than something to admire. The slope was mild enough to carry things up without breaking you, but elevated enough to give perspective. Water access was visible from where they were standing. The soil looked different here, darker at the edges, more alive. And the light at this hour, covering the upper portion of the slope in a long, slow warmth, spoke to what the mornings here would feel like, with a south-facing structure standing against it. Jack's eyes moved quickly across it. He was already calculating access distance, clearing cost, structural position, seasonal light patterns. His mind always arrived somewhere practical first. That was not coldness. That was care expressed in the language of preparation. Tu Tien had gone completely still. She was standing near the center of the land, not walking the boundary, not assessing, just standing in it with her hands loose at her sides, the way a person stands when they are trying to listen to something that isn't sound. There was a quality to her stillness that Jack recognized after years of watching her. It was the same stillness she had when something was not performing rightness, but simply being right in a way that didn't require her to convince herself. "Say something," he said quietly. She turned toward him slowly. "I can already picture where the kitchen garden would go." He looked at the ground where she was standing. Then he looked up at the slope. Then he looked back at her. He didn't say anything either, but he reached down, picked up a handful of soil, turned it in his hand, and let it fall. Good soil, the kind that meant the land had been patient, not exhausted. They did not decide immediately. It would be dishonest to say that the right land announces itself without any argument. They walked the full boundary twice, once quickly and once slowly, measuring pace against memory. Jack tested the soil at 3 different points along the slope, checking consistency. They sat down on a dry, flat section and pulled out the same sketches they had brought from the porch that morning. The hand-drawn lines, the margin notes, the photograph of the garden, and held them up against what they were actually looking at. The proportions did not just fit on paper, they fit in space. The vision they had been carrying in the abstract was landing somewhere real. There were things that weren't ideal. Road access would need work before construction vehicles could approach. The upper portion required clearing a season's effort at minimum. There were costs here beyond the price of the land itself. These were not small things. They discussed each one carefully, the way people discuss things they have decided to solve, rather than things they are using as reasons to retreat. Jack turned to Tu Tien after a long silence. "If we drive away today and someone else signs this tomorrow, can you live with that?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the slope, the light moving across the soil, the tree line holding its position to the north. She thought about the kitchen garden. She thought about the photograph she had been carrying in her bag since morning. "No," she said, clear and simple. "I can't." He nodded once. "Then we don't drive away." The signing was not cinematic. A table, documents, a pen that clicked too sharply in a quiet room. The seller was a reserved man who had held this land for years without building on it, watching the world develop around him, never quite letting go of the plot. He looked at Jack and Tu Tien for a moment before the paperwork began, with the expression of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, for the right people to arrive. Perhaps that was a story they were telling themselves. Perhaps it was true. When the deposit was confirmed and the copies were folded and placed carefully in Tu Tien's bag alongside the garden photograph and the old sketches, she exhaled very slowly. Not relief alone, something more complete than relief. The feeling of something that had been open a door held ajar by hope and uncertainty quietly, finally closing into place. Jack held the documents for a moment before setting them on the table. "From today," he said, "we have somewhere that actually belongs to us." Tu Tien pressed her palm flat against the table briefly. "The way you touch something to confirm it is real." They drove back to the land before going home. That part was not planned. The car simply turned that way, and neither of them questioned it. They stood at the top of the incline as the last light finished. The land looked different now, not more beautiful, not transformed. The same slope, the same soil, the same imperfect tree line. But it looked answerable now. It looked like a question that had agreed to stop being abstract, like a future that had finally chosen a shape. Jack talked through the foundation timeline, the access road, the first season of clearing. He was already inside it, already moving through it room by room, load by load, season by season, living 3 years ahead in the architecture of it. Tu Tien talked about what she would plant first. Not the kitchen garden yet, that was a second-year decision. Something simpler first, something with deep roots, something that would take hold slowly and confirm that the land had accepted them the way they had accepted it. They did not stay long. The light was gone and there was nothing left to see that their imagination wasn't already filling in, color by color, detail by detail. But before they left, they stood side by side for one quiet moment. No photograph, no performance of the occasion, just the two of them, and the ground beneath their feet, and the full weight of everything that was going to begin here.